Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Chelsea B. Davis with Veggies Do It Better. And on behalf of Free the Oregon Zoo Elephants, I want to welcome you to the Scars of Captivity, PTSD, and Elephants. This year has put a lot into perspective. With the pandemic and many of us continuing to shelter in place and quarantine, it has shown us just a glimpse of what captive animals endure every day, every minute of every day of their entire lives behind bars. Today, we hope to expand that understanding even more with the help of Dr. Bradshaw and Jenny Wiegand. But before we get started, I want to take a minute and ask a quick favor. Will everybody who's watching, please quickly share this live stream around Facebook? It really helps us to get the message out even further. And if you're more of an Instagrammer, definitely we encourage you to take some pictures and videos during this, and be sure to tag us so we can see your thoughts and share them. Our handles are FOES, that's F.O.Z.E, and Veggies Do It Better. Also, I want to mention the raffle we're doing. So anyone who likes or comments on this live stream in the Facebook event page will be entered to win a faux shirt of your choice, a fun little elephant pop socket by the Roaring Vegans, an End Speciesism bumper sticker, and a copy of Dr. Bradshaw's children's book, Elephant Letters. So please share your thoughts and questions. I'll be watching the feed and relay any questions you have to our speakers today during the Q&A portion. If you're watching through Zoom, you can utilize the chat feature to ask your questions. So to start us off today, I'm so excited to welcome my good friend, Danny West, the social media manager and event organizer for Free the Oregon Zoo Elephants.
Thank you, Chelsea, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Danny. I'm the social media manager around here. And if you haven't been following Free the Oregon Zoo Elephants, or as we call ourselves, FOES, here is our story. It all started with Courtney Scott, the founder and director of FOES, who visited the Oregon Zoo in 2008 and saw Packy. Now, if you're an Oregon native, you likely remember him. Courtney noticed his poor living conditions, spending a lifetime on concrete. Packy was the first captive bred elephant in North America after 44 years. He was born, lived, and died in captivity, most of his life spent isolated from the other elephants on a 1.2 acre exhibit with a cement floor. The absolute saddest thing you could fathom for any being, let alone one as sentient and intelligent as a majestic elephant. Courtney noticed his stereotypical behavior and consents, as any compassionate person would, that this elephant was unwell, unhappy, and being fatally overlooked and ignored. Courtney got a small group of people together that could also see this and knew something had to be done. They became the first voices for the captive-held elephants at the Oregon Zoo. Courtney's motivation for starting FOES was to make sure that a preserve was passed, which was supposed to be 240 acres and cost $12 million that Oregon Metro promoted and falsely narrated in 2008. It did get passed, and then it was never built. Instead, they built what the zoo calls a state-of-the-art exhibit, which consists today of 4 measly acres of sand for 5 elephants. And let me repeat that it was supposed to be 240 acres, which would be a beautiful space for around 5 elephants, but it's 4. And we still don't know where exactly all that money went. But this did not stop Courtney and the others. And in 2013, FOES became a nonprofit. Sadly, in 2017, after 3 years of being treated for tuberculosis and not responding to the tuberculosis drugs, Packy was murdered by the zoo, or as we call it, zoothanized. I know that sounds extreme and dramatic, but it's the truth. The fact is, the zoo didn't want to pay for the extra expense to give Packy the space he needed to live his life comfortably in quarantine, and the zoo had already decided to replace him with a younger breeding male. FOES continues to grow, and today, in Packy's honor, we speak for Chandra, who was taken from the wild and put into a cage on a continent, in a country and climate that are not meant for her or any other elephant. She suffers extremely at the zoo and has been for over 20 years. We speak for Rose, too, who has been subjected to either not having the space or choice to get away from a male elephant or painful artificial insemination numerous times. And she's bred 2 babies. If you remember, she lost her youngest, Lily, on her 6th birthday to captivity-related illness. Rose, too, was also beaten and anally raped with a bull hook over 176 times almost 20 years ago by a keeper who was fired and then went to work at another zoo shortly after. The elephant curator who watched this horrific act, he's still at the Oregon Zoo today, taking care of Rose 2 and the others. We speak for Shine, we speak for Samudra and for Samson. None of these beings deserve the life that they have been given to them at the hands of greedy corporations that lie and abuse and murder animals. And that, my friends, is precisely what zoos are. And we won't stop until each one of them is sent to a proper sanctuary where they can live on hundreds of acres, on grass and on soil, where they can eat trees, and most importantly, where they can be elephants. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being a voice. Enjoy this informative and powerful presentation that we have.
Thank you so much, Danny. All right, so now for the main event, we are incredibly honored to have both Dr. Gay Bradshaw and Jetty Wiegand speak on the scars of captivity and specifically PTSD in elephants. Gay Bradshaw holds a doctorate degrees in ecology and psychology and a master's in geophysics. Dr. Bradshaw's diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in free-living elephants launched the field of trans-species psychology. She's published in academic and popular media and has written several books on the subject, including Minding the Animal Psyche, The Elephant Letters, The Story of Billy and Kani, which is part of the giveaway today. So by commenting on the live stream and asking questions and liking and sharing, then you're going to be entered to win a copy of that book. She's also written the Pulitzer-prize nominated Elephants on the Edge, What Animals Teach Us About Humanity, Carnivore Minds, Who These Fearsome Animals Really Are, and many more. Jenny Wiegand, holds a BA in criminal justice, a psychology minor, and a master's credits in substance abuse counseling. She has over 30 years of experience in working in the field of trauma and healing, and enjoys using the sanctuary model of trauma-informed care to help better understand the effects of trauma in order to support an individual's unique path to healing. This work has led her to helping elephants in captivity. Her mission is to use trauma-informed care to help elephants heal. So now I'm going to welcome both Jenny and Gay, and then I'm going to share the screen so we can start the presentation. Right there, and then present. All right, you ladies are up.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chelsea. I know I can speak for Gay when I say both of us are so happy to be here today on behalf of Shendra. And really, we just want to thank you for having us here today. So let's start. Let's get a picture of Shendra up on the screen. And Gay, if you wouldn't mind, why don't you start us off by reading a passage from your book, Elephants on the Edge, What Animals Teach Us About Humanity.
Yes, well, I'd like to add my thanks for being included in this wonderful opportunity. I first felt the danger when the birds suddenly became silent and the air stilled. Then came the deep thunder of man's guns. The cold clarity of memory filled my mind, an image of the massacre of many seasons ago. We lost many, even a few children, too young to be hunted for ivory, but felled in the hail of bullets. Smoke and sound burst from all around, and the calves ran screaming as they saw their mothers fall. I called the rest to follow, and we ran into the forest, where I knew we would be safe and no one could find us. We spent several days and nights there. Gunfire still could be heard. We drank water from the river, ate and rested. The little ones cried, some too frightened to even nurse. I remembered what my mother, a great leader among our people, had taught me. One day I would tell my daughter the story of my family, and all that I had learned. And she would tell her children, we would survive, we would live again. I chose this passage from my book, seems so long ago now, because I think it gives us an entree to the sort of inside experience of many, many elephants who, like Chandra, have been subjected to human violence and the suffering and the ravages of trauma that they have sustained.
So Gay, you were the first person to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder in elephants. Can you tell us how this came about?
Yeah, actually, it was something I had never even dreamed of. In the 1990s, I was part of a National Science Foundation team of scientists who were going to South Africa to look into the translocation and the effects of translocation, moving African lions from all parts of Africa into South Africa. Now, at the time, the purpose of these translocations, which included elephants and what they call the Big Five, these are the 5 species which really are the attraction for tourists. At the time, apartheid was just finishing. And so in the years before, there'd been preparation anticipating that apartheid would be vanquished and that people would start to come to South Africa again and really begin the ecotourism trade. So during that time, though, prior, these animals, including the elephants, had been extirpated, which is locally basically made extinct. There was no elephants around, no lions around. And so all of these translocations, both of lions and elephants and other animals, into national and provincial parks, as well as private reserves, was undergoing. Now, when I arrived, the translocations had largely completed. But I arrived in South Africa, and the first thing that I heard was, instead of lions, was the park ranger and biologists going on and on and on about rhinoceroses. And not only that, rhinoceroses and elephants. And so this was something that began my own learning. That what I learned is that there was an unprecedented event of elephants who were killing rhinoceroses. And what I learned and began in my observation was these elephants were not and had not lived what we would call a natural and normal life in the wild. So what it turned out is when I returned back, I was studying neuropsychology, neurosciences, and psychology. And I looked into the biographies, the autobiographies of these young elephants who were responsible for killing the rhinoceroses and sexually assaulting them. And when I did that, it turns out that their biographies were very much those of someone like Chandra, someone who had undergone severe traumas. So what happened were these babies, again, this was all in preparation for trying to bring the elephants into the zoos. Now, at the time, in the 1980s, it was very difficult to transport a full-grown male elephant or a full-grown elephant. And so they wanted to have babies, infants, but from 1 to, say, 4 years old, who were easily transported. So in the next slide that you'll see, the elephants were experienced what they call culls, mass killings. It's not unusual, but in this particular event, there were mass culls that these baby elephants had experienced, and they witnessed, these were helicopters shooting down from the sky. They witnessed their mothers, their aunties, their siblings, their cousins, all massacred. And they were taken, these babies, and again, they're babies from 1 to 4 years old. And they were tied to the bodies, they were tethered to the bodies of their family until they could be readied and transported to another park to repopulate the park. So what they did is that they put them, in the next slide shows is that they would grab these babies. And as you can see in the next slide, I don't know if you can see up close, but if you look at the baby's eyes, they're all bugged out. I mean, they're absolutely terrified. And you can see the dead and hacked body of the mother or auntie that is next to the baby. So they were put in these trucks, translocated and put in these other parks where they have never been. And they were forced to survive on their own. Now, that's all traumatic. And in the sense of that, what we talk about is that they did not experience, it's not just what happened to them, it's what they lacked. So it turns out when you look at it from the perspective of the brain, from the perspective of psychology, these individual elephants had suffered a series of profound psychological traumas. They had witnessed their families being killed. They had experienced this horrific event. They were taken to another park where they had to live on their own. They did not have the normative, loving care of what we call a safe container of all the loving care of a family, the natal family, which is really the nucleus of an elephant civilization. It's the mother and the aunties and the siblings. Now for young males, which these were young males who were the perpetrators as such for killing all these rhinoceroses, and there were over 100 rhinoceroses and sexually assaulting. They were, when they're like about normally when they're 10 or 12, 13, sometime around that time, they leave the natal family and they are brought into the graces of older male bulls, older male elephants, and they are mentored from teenagehood until their early 30s, which is when they go into MUS, which is sexual maturity in their early 30s. So it wasn't the fact of these horrific events had happened to these young babies, but the fact of that they did not experience this nurturing care. And what was critical and really what was so shocking when you look through the lens of neuropsychology and trauma was everything that we know, I mean, that was all documented, that happened to them on the outside left these scars and etched scars of trauma in them psychologically, which led to this unprecedented behavior, this unprecedented violence that the elephants projected onto rhinoceroses. And it was never happened before, never. Elephants are what we call prosocial. They're very loving. There's a lot of myths going around, particularly in captive institutions and zoos and circuses, that elephants dominate. There is no sense of domination. And you can talk to individuals who have spent many, many years, Dame Daphne, Carol Buckley, caring for elephants and in the presence of elephants. They do not dominate. So what happened is the fact that they killed these rhinoceroses with whom they're actually very friendly, they're herbivorous, they're not hunters, was just way off the charts in terms of the extraordinary experiences that they had, which forced them into this realm of psychological breakdown.
So let's just be clear on this. So the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in these elephants, you use the same diagnostic criteria that's used when that diagnosis is given to prisoners, to survivors of abuse, to veterans. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. The same diagnosis that was developed, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex PTSD, which is CPTSD, which is really what Chandra and these young males and other elephants who are brought into captivity and have these things happen. Complex PTSD, as we'll talk about maybe a little later, is when an individual is subjected, typically at a young age, like these were and Chandra, and then successive traumas. So the PTSD was developed specifically for humans, and those criteria conformed very scientifically, rigorously to what was observed in these individuals.
So can you explain why that was so groundbreaking? Why did people find that so startling, the diagnosis?
Well, the first thing is that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, again, as I said, was developed and has been applied to humans, veterans, Holocaust survivors, domestic abuse, etc. It had never been openly diagnosed and identified in non-human animals, in elephants and other animals. Now, I say that openly because I was able to do the research and come to the conclusions and perform the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress in the elephants for the very reason that all of science, neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, biomedical sciences, runs on a model of unitary model of brain, mind, behavior, and consciousness. That is to say that, and neuroscientists subsequent to this have come out, at Cambridge University came out with this admission that all animals, rats, cats, octopuses, even invertebrates, elephants, have the same brains and the capacities of thinking, feeling, consciousness that we do. So they're comparable. They're not identical, but they're comparable. And the term comparable is very important because we can say that they use the same model, and that justifies neuroscientists and biomedical researchers using what they call animal models, which we see here is Pepper. Pepper is a chimpanzee who was used in biomedical research, and cats and rats are used as well as chimpanzees and monkeys as surrogates for humans, because these experiments which induce trauma, which impose all sorts of torture on these individuals, is prohibited ethically and legally for humans. So there's no reason that these billions and billions of dollars are spent to experiment on non-human animals for the purpose of understanding human trauma, human psychological disorders, and physiological disorders. So the groundbreaking was because when I came out and with this diagnosis, it was unshakable. It was based on very conservative science, known science, except it was not recognized openly. It was statistically significant, meaning that there were more than 100 events. That was to say, there were more than 100 rhinoceroses who had been sexually assaulted and killed. So that statistically, what could not be written off as an anecdote. And there was additional quote unquote data that came out when I started investigating further in India, Asia, and Africa, where elephants who had been subjected to extreme human violence, whether through beating and made into captivity and submission, or those in the quote unquote free living who had been killed in wars, who had been killed for ivory, whose families had been broken up. There were other data where female elephants were neglecting their babies, unprecedented. Where male elephants were killing each other at unprecedented rates, never seen before. That's never seen. Infanticide has never been seen before in the wild. And so all of that was really quite shocking for people because for another reason, it was scientifically grounded. You couldn't argue with it. There was nothing to argue about. But the other was the fact of that we could no longer just write off an animal as some behavioral thing who could feel and could think and do various kinds of things. They're psychological beings like us with the same capacities and vulnerabilities to feel and think, aspirations, dream, and unfortunately suffer psychological trauma. The other is what we're experiencing writ large right now, and that is our actions, our behavior, our speech has an impact on nature. And nature is finite in the sense of that you can't do whatever you do and what you want to do to an elephant and not have it have a profound impact on that individual.
So part of what came out of your discovery and your research was also the creation of a new field called trans-species psychology, also called the scientific architecture of animal rights. What is trans-species psychology and why is it so important in understanding Chandra?
Well, trans-species psychology is the term and the field that I established to bring attention to what I was discussing earlier, that all of science runs on this single model of brain, mind, and behavior. It extends it to invertebrates, octopuses, bees, you name it, have the brains and the capacities that go with it comparable to our own. And I named the field to bring attention that science is unethically using its data and theory and knowledge of this selectively. So all of this is known. It's just no one says it. So the other component, which is really critical, is what we know about ourselves can be applied and make an inference to another animal, and vice versa, which has been accepted, but we can do that with equal rigor. So it's not like anthropomorphizing is perfectly fine. In fact, it's a very powerful, a number of scientists have made a point that it's a very important tool. It just isn't recognized. And the reason it's not recognized is because if we openly recognize that Chandra and other animals have the capacities comparable to us that warrant us the privilege of not being subjected ethically and legally to these kinds of torture and these kinds of subjugation, then our whole civilization will break down. Everything in our modern Western society is based on animal exploitation. So to openly recognize that Chandra has a mind and a brain and the capacities to feel like a prisoner who has done nothing but just be there, who is an economic source for the institutions who do what they do to her, really would turn things upside down. And for Chandra, why is that important? Because we see from the trans-species psychology perspective, from the understanding of real science, unexpurgated science, uncensored science, we see what we would see in a human. We see a soul who is in agony. And what we see her doing, bobbing, swaying, all those things, those are symptoms that are synonymous with what is known in PTSD and severe psychological trauma.
So let's step back for a second. Can you define what is trauma, what is post-traumatic stress disorder, and how are they different?
Trauma is, it's divided into, you can call it physical trauma. So for example, if someone is shot, that's a physical trauma, and that's when the body is just overwhelmed. Psychological trauma, the two are intertwined, because if you are shot, there's definitely psychological or wounded or tortured in that kind of way. The psychological is a part of that. But psychological trauma also is this notion of overwhelmed, that we experience something to which that we are not evolved to be able to cope. So chronic stress is the same kind of thing. In other words, we have all these coping mechanisms when we experience stress. So for example, I go outside and I feel cold. That's a kind of a stress, but I can put a coat on, I can somehow mitigate that. Same thing psychologically. Someone might get really angry at work, and we have various coping mechanisms for that. You know, some come back into some kind of spiritual, some kind of terms like, I'm going to go have a lunch break. In other words, we have these coping mechanisms because there's stress in our life in different ways. Unfortunately, the stress of our culture is just way off the charts now. Mm-hmm. But psychological trauma, which Chandra has experienced and which the young bulls experienced, it was just so overwhelming. Now, when you get into PTSD, so trauma is really the experience of an individual, of an overwhelming event that they can't cope with. Now, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was coined and it was codified by psychiatrists and psychologists to describe events that individuals had experienced. Typically, historically, this has to do with veterans, used to be called shell shock. And then with the Holocaust and all the successive wars in Vietnam, people began to really not feel like there was shame associated with it, but rather that these were symptoms that an individual experienced that were so overwhelming, that were so out of his or her experience, and that the symptoms of PTSD is really a constellation of ways in which an individual is trying to cope with what they've experienced. And everyone is different. There's a lot of overlap in the very specific codification, but generally speaking, some people can withdraw, they get very depressed, there's self-harming, sometimes what we call is affect dysregulation, where there's violence They're unable to kind of maintain because something triggers them. They have what we call flashbacks. People are probably familiar with that kind of thing. And nightmares. Dame Daphne, I worked very closely with Dame Daphne and talked about the criteria. Did she see these kinds of symptoms in the orphans that she rescued? And that's in the book. It goes through very, very specifically all the criteria with the question of, are these elephants exhibiting these kinds of symptoms?
So let's take a look at this next picture, Gay. And this is a picture of an elephant restraint device, an ERD. It's also called a rape rack, and it's used to artificially inseminate an elephant. Zoos state they use this for conservation elephant efforts, survival of the species. But it's really exactly what you were just talking about. It's trauma. It's physical trauma and it's psychological trauma. And I think that what's important is that we know that trauma transmits, right? So that means that the trauma that a female elephant, a mother elephant experiences, that trauma is transmitted to her baby. The inside, right? The inside of the baby receives that trauma. And so, and it's not just that baby, trauma is generational. It goes across time. And I think that, if you think about that and you look at elephants in any form of captivity, every single elephant, either directly or indirectly through the trauma transmission, bears the scars, the internal scars of the cull that you showed us pictures of before, because that's all a part of their trauma history. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing for me when I look at this, and we know that Shendra, whether they use this device with her or not, she was still forced. Forced breeding is the same thing. It's still a traumatic experience. And I think the thing that I look at from a larger outside perspective is, don't we as human beings really need to stop adding events that are part of this trauma transmission?
Now, let me say something a little bit about trauma transmission. There's been a lot of research that has been done on humans, as well as with rats and mice in experiments, looking at how trauma transmits across generations. And that's very well established. It's socially, in the sense of how, say, a traumatized mother or traumatized father behaves, and there's symptoms of trauma, symptoms of PTSD. Those are transmitted in terms of their interactions with their family as well as their children. Trauma is also transmitted neurobiologically. In other words, as you were talking about, a mother who's gone under a lot of stress, and those are transmitted across generations. We have to understand also that the effects of trauma are very pernicious. They depress the immune system. They have all sorts of effects internally, as well as symptoms, which are things that we can detect from the outside. I think this picture says so much. I mean, it's absolutely horrific to think that this has been constructed for a living being, for the sole purpose of subjecting them to institutionalized rape. That's what it is. Both rape of the father and the mother, because the males are also to extract semen. Males go through a procedure where they're forced to ejaculate. The semen is collected, and then that semen is injected into the vagina of the individual. Now, I know there was I think it was Woodland Park, there was an individual elephant up there, female, who had at the time undergone over 60, 70 what's called AI, artificial insemination events. And the majority of them never took. And there was a comment by one of the veterinarians or one of the zoo people by saying, well, we probably went into her urinary tract rather than her vagina. I mean, it's absolutely grotesque. So that whole thing is there. And of course, the event is trauma. The the baby, if the pregnancy does come to term. And that's very hard. There's millions and millions of dollars that have been, that are continuing to be funding this kind of research to increase the capacity for elephants to become pregnant in zoos. Little baby elephants are huge economic draws. So they want baby elephants. It's very difficult for the females to get pregnant. And that's natural. We just have to look at ourselves as females, or we look in prison studies when women are under a lot of stress, duress, whether it's physical, they're starving, their cycling stops. So they call it in the zoos and the industry flatlining. It's kind of an ugly, ugly word. So the other thing is that it's not just through the mother. Now scientists have found out that stress and trauma is transmitted through the father in the reproduction cycle. So yes, we get over and over. And again, we can look at human situations. In other words, when you look at the histories of someone who becomes very violent, who has severe psychological, psychiatric issues, or even quote unquote mild, there is a history of trauma in their family. They have suffered abuse. And typically the reason they suffer abuse is because their parents or whatever have suffered trauma or some kind of abuse. So that is the cycle of violence, and that does get perpetuated through. So that's why we're seeing things like, which are extraordinary for elephants, infanticide. Never happens in the wild, never happens. People say, oh, it's because she's a young mother, she steps on her baby by mistake. That's ridiculous. If it is, it's because she's out of her mind. Other people have asked me, why does a mother kill her baby elephant? And one response might be, one doesn't know. She does not want to perpetuate the suffering of her baby elephant going through what she has gone through.
So is it fair to say that an elephant born in a zoo is not on the inside the same as an elephant that's born in the wild? That those two babies genetically are different on the inside because one has experienced trauma and one has not?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a very good point. And that is that, we can see, we've seen this in sort of very spectacular ways. We see it in our everyday life. You might be having a conversation with someone and, everything seems to be fine and da-da-da-da-da. And you find out later that that individual's husband or wife or child has just died, and you don't pick it up. So we don't know what's going on the inside. We have some very famous individuals, Holocaust survivors. Primo Levi survived the Holocaust. He became a very famous writer. He lived into his 70s, and it was inferred that he committed suicide. He was quote unquote successful. He had a wonderful life, blah, 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 blah. So in other words, really what we're seeing with elephants in these captive breeding things, and also in the wild, because of the severe trauma and the violence which is being meted out, what we're seeing is not only physical extinction, we're seeing psychological extinction. That the elephant that we look at in the zoo is not a real elephant in the same sense. Now, that does not mean that she does not have that spark, those deep-rooted seeds, which go back millions of years into elephant society. But if this persists, we definitely are causing extinction of elephants in captivity.
So let's move into our next part, which is several videos that show Chandra in her habitat while at the zoo. And Gay, if while these are going on, why don't you comment on what you see, and we'll have a little bit of dialogue of what's going on in the pictures.
Okay, well, this first video, which actually does have a lot of noise in it, really brings up an important point, is that elephants have very sensitive feet, and they communicate with their feet over miles and miles and kilometers and kilometers. So an elephant who is in this kind of situation like Chandra, terribly on concrete, terribly hard substrate, unnatural, in a city, is picking up all sorts of noise, and that's so damaging. I mean, we can experience it ourselves in various smaller ways. So what you're seeing here is her pacing. You know, elephants need hundreds and hundreds of miles. Ideally, they need to be able to walk, but this is stereotypic. In other words, this is repeated behavior. We see some other things in terms of her bobbing and swaying and like that. Yeah, here's the noise. You can imagine yourself being in that situation day after day after day after day. So, you know, walking for an elephant is really important, and we'll get into that in terms of what sanctuaries offer, because they need to walk, they forage, that's natural. They socialize, that's how they bring coherence to each other and the world that they live in. But it strengthens their legs, and they're very heavy. And so they need the strength in their leg, and they need to be able to move in order to distribute that weight. Most all elephants who come from zoos and captive institutions and go to sanctuary have severe foot problems for that reason. And again, it's also because of the psychological trauma and stress that they're undergoing, because as we know ourselves, it depresses our ability. All of that energy that is being directed to just plain survival and defending oneself, when you go to sanctuary, all that energy can be diverted to healing, because they are supported by a healing environment.
Yeah, I think for myself, when I watch these videos of Chandra, you know, as you've talked about before, the trauma is an inside view. And so it's not something that's always visible. And sure, you can look at Chandra, you can look at, you know, other animals in a zoo, and you may see the physical, visible scars of trauma. And yet most of the time you do not. So if you look at an animal in a zoo, just because you don't see the physical wound, don't think that there's not a trauma wound in that animal.
And also I have to say, Jenny, that, you know, this is one thing, excuse me, I just wanted to bring this point up, is that most people see an elephant and they identify, just like an orca, they go to the Sea World or some aquarium and they identify elephant with zoo in captivity. Mm-hmm. And they don't really experience, except for people who are fortunate enough to say they visit Asia when they visit elephants in the wild, or Africa, but they don't see like what she's doing now, bobbing back and forth, swaying. That is not behavior. Behavior is just, and you asked me earlier, you know, why is a psychological, neuropsychological, trans-species psychology important for understanding Chandra? Because behavior, that's a psychological behavior, like her swaying and her bobbing here, is just one expression of a vast psyche. So really what you're seeing here is a voice, is a symptoms of profound trauma and profound suffering. And that's her way of just holding on to some shred, the thread of sanity and survival. And we really should applaud her for that.
Yeah, and I agree. You know, it's you talk about it's an expression, and it's not a behavior. It is an expression. And you know, back to looking at the trauma, that we also don't always know what we call trauma triggers. You know, it's what is the event that causes that flashback, that memory. And anybody that's suffered from severe trauma, they typically do have a trigger, and a trigger can be a smell, it can be a sound, it can be a food, it can be, you know, any number of things. And that could also, you know, it could take 20 years before somebody experiences that trigger that literally in that moment takes them back to that traumatic event. I think, you know, to put the trauma-informed care lens to it, sanctuary model, Sandra Bloom, when you learn about that model, one of the very first things they ask you is to look at the difference between these two questions. And the first question is, what's wrong with you? And so if you look at the behavior, if you look at the expression, like if you look at Chandra right now, from a zoo perspective, they're going to look at it from the perspective of what's wrong with you. And when you look at it from a what's wrong with you perspective, that's where it's about control. And you'll hear statements such as, oh, that's a mean elephant. That elephant's aggressive, watch out. That elephant's antisocial and has to be by itself because it doesn't know how to get along with anybody. That elephant's a picky eater and is so hard to get, to eat any food. Those are all statements that reinforce that perspective of looking at it from a perspective of what's wrong with you. Yeah. The trauma-informed care perspective answers to the question of, when you see that behavior, what's happened to you? It's an expression of something going on inside. And so to ask what's happened to you immediately takes control out of the equation, and it immediately invites the conversation of, well, what are the traumas that this individual has suffered? They've been, watched their family slaughtered. They've, incredible abuses and incredible aggression forced upon them, and many of the things that you've already talked about. But it completely changes how we look at that behavior. And trauma, trans-species psychology really gave us the psychological framework to utilize when working with animals that have experienced trauma. We've never had a way to do that. We've never had a way before to look at this behavior from Chandra and say, wait a minute, this isn't a psychological expression of her trauma. And I think, trauma does not discriminate amongst species. Trauma is trauma. And, it's time for all of us, every time you see an animal in captivity, it's time for all of us to look at it from the perspective of what's happened to you, and really to start responding from that perspective.
And one thing that's so important about, this is getting back to why was this so groundbreaking. The other component was it really introduced the concept of trauma into the conversation when we're talking about non-human animals, when we're talking about elephants in their situation. For one, trans-species psychology, which is neurosciences and psychology, gives us a framework to objectively evaluate, for example, what's going on with here. So it comes right out of science. This is a traumatized, severely traumatized individual, and it is unlikely that she is going to survive very long. That's very clear. That the trauma component is also so important too, because it gives voice. This is voicing. She's speaking. We're not talking about vocalization, which could be part of it. This is her symptoms. It's not behavior, it's symptoms. These are voices. So look at her when she's moving. These are voices that she's actually calling to us in that way. And what it does is trauma is a relational construct. So it immediately says, what's causing her to do this? Why is this, who is making this happen to her? So it's not just what happened to you, but who made this happen to her?
Yeah, and that's a great point, Gay. So let's move into, you brought up this question. What is the difference between a zoo and a sanctuary?
Yeah, maybe we could have that photo of...
Oh yeah, well, we can talk about that one. Let's do that one for a second. So Gay, this is, some people could look at this and say, oh, look at Chandra, isn't it cute? We get to see her, sticking her trunk out and exploring, and, wow, isn't that cute? What do you see when you look at that?
I think it's absolutely heartbreaking. What I see is just her desperate reaching out for love, because love is nature. Love is the way elephants are love, animals in nature are really the substrate of love. And it's her desperate, cry and effort to connect with love and recharge that spark inside her.
Yeah, and I think when I look at that picture, I look in her eyes, and eyes are the window to the soul. And really what I see is, I see Chandra pleading. I see her begging to be able to be the elephant that she was put on this earth to be. And I agree. I think it's a sad picture, and it's her trying to go back to your passage from your book. It's beyond trying to survive, right? And it's her asking for the ability to thrive and for a quality of life that she absolutely is not getting in this scenario.
Yeah.
So that takes us into the segue of what is the difference between a zoo and a sanctuary?
Yeah, so what we have here is on the right hand, we have elephants in sanctuary. It's at Boonlat Sanctuary in Thailand. And on the left, we have, I'm not sure if that's Chandra or not, we have an elephant in a
yeah, it's Chandra.
In a zoo. So first of all, I just ask everyone, look at the contrast. I mean, they're small pictures, but look at the contrast. And kind of feel viscerally, put yourself in the zoo situation, Chandra's situation, and put yourself in the situation where one of these elephants are. These all were elephants that were brutalized, broken like she was, went through severe training, which is essentially torture to make elephants submit. And they labored in whatever way. And then now they're in sanctuary. So first of all, is just kind of get that visceral difference in terms of how you might feel. Physically, we can see that it's just depauperate. It's hard. There's concrete, hard, even if it's soil substrate. There's isolation, and we heard all the noise. And essentially, she's living a life of control. Jenny, you brought that up. She is there at the whim of whomever is making her be there. These elephants on the right, elephants in sanctuary, the key thing is the stressors have been removed. They're living in healthy situations. Those are stressors. The difference there between the two, you can say, just a crude approximation, not even considering their past trauma, but their current chronic stress and trauma. The difference that you see between those two really gives you an estimate, first order estimate of the kind of stress that Chandra is undergoing. So in sanctuaries, we see on the right, they have nature, that's them, that's who an elephant is. They get to be an elephant whenever, whomever with, and whatever, eat when they want. They're never told what to do. If there is an occasion, for example, where they do have terrible physical and physiological issues like their feet, they're not told, they're asked, may we give you a foot bath treatment, etc. And in contrast, in the zoo, that's just like a human prison. The purpose of a human prison and the purpose of a zoo really is to strip away that individual sense of self, strip away that individual sense of having any control over her life, any decision, and keep her in fear and submission. She doesn't know what's going to happen to her, when is going to happen. Whereas an animal in sanctuary, they do have the scars, and as you mentioned, the triggers. But the whole purpose of sanctuary is to rebuild, revitalize this sense of safety and security, which then allows internal healing and for them to become a real elephant again.
Yeah, I think that, everything that you've mentioned is so critical. And, Chandra on the left at the zoo, she is always in this hyper alert. She is never going to be relaxed, and she's always going to be wondering what's going to happen next. There's nothing predictable about that, because there's nothing predictable about who's going to come at her, what's going to come at her next. Whereas at least in the other picture, you're right, you can see physically the difference, much more relaxed. You can sense the calm and the peace just by changing an environment. If nothing else, just that simple thing in and of itself makes a huge difference. So that takes us into the next slide, which is a video of the Elephant Refuge North America, which is Carol Buckley's sanctuary. And maybe while this is playing, comments about what truly makes this a sanctuary, because not all places that call themselves sanctuaries are sanctuaries. I hate to say that, but it's the truth. And so when we're watching this, what truly makes this a sanctuary, and why is this an ideal place for an elephant like Chandra?
Hi, I'm Carol Buckley. I'm the founder and president of Elephant Aid International. And what I want to talk to you about today is our new project in Georgia. It's Elephant Refuge North America. And it's a place that we've created so that captive held elephants can come and live a more natural life. So this 850-acre piece of land really meets the need. Because of the topography, the rolling hills, because of the rainfall, 50 inches of rain every year, the natural humidity, the vegetation, the diverse habitat, we feel that this particular location will be great for elephants that have to remain in captivity. So what I want to do is take you on a tour, show you every aspect of our facility, all of our improvements, the barns, all the structures, but also, most importantly, to show you the habitat. Because the habitat is so diverse and so important for elephant welfare, and we are confident that it is going to meet their needs. So come, let's go.
Gay, this picture that we're looking at here is a picture of Carol with Misty at the elephant sanctuary. And what's happening in this picture and how is it embodying what trauma-informed care looks like?
Well, before I say that, I just hope that viewers really could feel what Carol showed, that the home that she's creating for elephants. And Carol, you know, has done remarkable. I write about specifically, if you have a copy of my book, Elephants on the Edge, specifically, and then we actually have a video of interview with Carol and a series that talks about how she has introduced, and she wasn't calling it that basically that's what is called trauma-informed care. Very, very deep and sensitive. And as a result of that experience and skill and heart, she has transformed elephant lives that would seem, where they came from circuses and zoos, would seem irreparable. So there's true transformation. And I think that video really shows, reflects that. And this picture here is one of my favorites. It's Carol, and she's literally shaping herself as a carer to an elephant, Misty. There's so much in that photo. First of all, there's incredible trust between the elephant and Carol, and the shaping, and that's literal and philosophical and metaphorical. Carol, as well as Dame Daphne, their success in terms of helping heal. Trauma does not go away, but what it does is it reignites the internal resources of an individual to be able to engage in life in a healthful and joyful and enriching way. And so this here really shows how she's listening in. She's asking Misty, as well as they're sharing love, but really asking, and responding to the needs and desires of what that individual requires.
Yeah, when I look at this picture, from a trauma-informed care lens, I think it's such a profound picture myself. And, number one, trauma-informed care, safety is first and foremost. You will never heal, you will never change any aspect of trauma without safety. Safe environment, safety in the relationships, et cetera. And we've talked about that some. The other thing is the autonomy. Misty has the opportunity here, and this is sanctuary, this trauma-informed care. She has the ability to either choose to engage in that interaction with Carol or not. She can walk away at any point if it becomes uncomfortable, or, she can leave. And autonomy is so critical in trauma-informed care. People and animals, elephants, Misty, Chandra, they have to feel like they have a say, a voice in their life and in the quality of their life. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly is the whole piece about trust. And it's not just that Misty trusts the environment, which is part of why it's now safe. It's predictable. She knows what's going to happen in the environment, unlike what happens in a zoo. And it's not only the trust that she has developed with Carol, and that happened over time. That, trust me, that did not happen overnight. That happens over time. That happens after, time and time again, Misty has learned that what's going to happen is okay. And but it's more that Misty has developed the trust within herself. And that's a critical component in healing trauma, is that the survivor of trauma understands that they can begin to trust the decisions that they make, that they can make good decisions about their life. And so, I don't know, to me, this picture encapsulates all of that. And I think the other thing for me is, zoos, they're all about elephants being there for human exploitation. Zoos want the elephant to change. And trauma-informed care, a sanctuary, is the human is there for the elephant. Carol is here for Misty. Misty is not here for Carol. Carol is here for Misty. And trauma-informed care sanctuary, the only way it works is when the human changes. So Gay, let's end this with, why don't you read another passage from your book?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. On behalf of the Indian nations, Sioux scholar Vine Deloria demanded of white America, we talk, you listen. I think that the elephant's plea is much the same. By listening, we are asked to ethically and practically challenge what has seemed indelible, the uniqueness and privilege of being human. We are asked to be part of elephant suffering, to own what has happened and is happening to elephants as something that involves us as much as them. The elephant experience entreats us to come around the fire ring, to sit and listen while the embers burn and the clear night domes above, much like our ancestors did thousands of years ago. For in the elephant's tail is a story of our own past, and poignantly what can be our future. Even more important, it is not so much that elephants are like us. They are us. and we are them.
That's beautiful, Gabe. Thank you.
Now, I think there might be some questions that will be monitored, or?
Thank you so much. Did you guys want to talk about your center real quick? I think we skipped that slide.
Oh, well, yeah, I love this photo. This is our homepage. Our organization, nonprofit, which I founded just shortly thereafter. My work began with elephant PTSD, the Karula Center for Nonviolence. Our tagline is very much what Jenny and I were talking about. It's being who nature elephants need us to be. And again, this is a message of trauma, is that we need to care, we need to free Chandra, and simultaneously we need to, in so doing, we liberate ourselves. So really what's key to ending the suffering for elephants is not to cause trauma, and to not cause trauma is to end the violence in ourselves and transform that into the beauty and love that all of nature shares. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, and then I did want to just have this call to action up for those who are watching. I've been seeing a couple of comments about what you can do. So you can help us retire Chandra by contacting the Oregon Zoo. You can call or email them, specifically Lynn Peterson at oregonmetro.gov. So contacting Metro, and we have scripts available in the description. So now I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to invite Danny and Courtney to turn on your screens and unmute yourself, and we're going to do a quick Q&A. The first question is, I have read that zoos and other places that hold animals captive sometimes routinely give the animals antidepressants, antipsychotics, I'm just going to skip that word, and other psychoactive drugs. How can we use this information to advocate for these animals to be surrendered to sanctuaries? Can an FIOA request be used to receive medical records? Have any of you had any experience with that?
Well, I'll make, maybe Courtney, you'll have some comments on that, and Jenny. Yes, the idea, I mean, this is kind of ironic, is that the introduction of Prozac, like for tigers, to get them to stop pacing, and various other kinds of psychotropic medication, is really tacit understanding that these animals are suffering tremendous psychological breakdown and post-traumatic stress disorder. So it is a recognition that these are psychological beings. You don't do it to a rock, right? No offense to the rock. So ironically it is. However, it still comes from the whole thing of, let's just stop it. What's wrong with that elephant? What's wrong with that tiger? We'll give them a pill and she'll just stop pacing. The source of the pacing, the source of whatever they're trying to get rid of, are the people who are holding, the institutions who are holding those animals prisoner.
Have you ever heard of anybody or a group having luck obtaining medical records like that so they could use it as part of their advocacy work?
I believe with FOIA, I mean, I think it depends on the institution. Courtney might be able to speak more. All of those records should be made available.
Yeah, we have a long history of getting records from Metro, who is the government agency over the Oregon Zoo. And we've had, very high costs associated with the records. But maybe because of the pressure we've exerted and the meetings we've had with the zoo director, who's now retired, we have had better luck lately getting records. And I think I've shared some of the Chandra's records with you, Gay. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear from her records how much she's suffering. She's always diagnosed with severe and profound stereotypical behavior. Her toes are all, I don't know, what you call it, fractured. Mm-hmm. They're all fractured. So she's walking on a pain, she's suffering pain in every way possible. So yeah, we do have some of the records. So yeah, but that is helpful. But the thing is that we've noticed, at least what I've seen, is people don't seem to understand or pay attention to records. Maybe Gay, you have something more to say about that, but no matter how many times we post about that on Facebook, for instance, it doesn't seem to register. I'm not quite sure why that is. People who love zoos will just say, well, they look happy. You know, we say, well, look at the records. And we even post the records right on our page. So I'm not sure if that's just cognitive dissonance on the part of the public or what's involved in that.
I think there's a number of reasons. You know, cognitive dissonance. I mean, and this is the whole thing about trauma, is a lot of people just don't want to go there. You know, it's like opening up this door, and it's so disturbing. This is with humans as well. They don't want to go there. This happens a lot with veterans. They don't know how to relate, and people don't want to go there. You know, it's too horrendous. I do think also that there's just still been a reluctance, even though people are sympathetic with elephants in captivity and animals in captivity, et cetera, to really understand them as psychological beings. I mean, to see them as prisoners, as victims of torture, who are being exploited for economic and psychological reasons. And I think there's a real reluctance to really see that. And that's because our culture is so deeply ingrained in so many ways of keeping ourselves separate and privileged from the rest of nature. So again, from a psychological, as well as the cultural, as well as an economic perspective, it's huge to look at Chandra and say, you are the same as me. You know, as Daphne would say, they're better than us, which is true. They never do to us what we've done to them. So I think the whole issue, like Jenny keeps underscoring, the psychological understanding and the profound, and it's not just doing recycling and all that kind of stuff. That's great. You know, going vegan is fantastic. All of those are, but it's the internal transformation that we have to make. That is the real message of understanding trauma, and that elephant trauma is that we have to make the internal transformation, giving up our privilege, making ourselves vulnerable. And it's not so bad. I mean, in the sense of like we were talking about rock climbing, you know, it's that first step that's kind of difficult. But when you make yourself vulnerable and open to an animal, it's extraordinary. And I know that Carol speaks eloquently that and perhaps, you know, listeners here have their own experience with the animals with whom they live, or a tree that they're with. When you let go of your privilege, when you are giving up that control, it's actually quite lovely because we have that burden. So I think that's it. I think that the psychological is so critical. I think it's critical to understand it's not just elephants, you know, it's worms, you know, it's turtles, it's tortoises. We have tortoises, just special needs tortoises have suffered, rabbits. It's all of nature. And for us to just step down and begin that path of unification where we make ourselves vulnerable again, I think that's important.
Yeah, and if I can add one thing to that, I think, you know, I think people look at medical records, and because of that denial, because of not wanting to truly take ownership of having to make change, people see that as, oh, well, they're doing something, right? They're medicating something, but people don't really then say, but again, what is the trauma behind that? And I think that's one of the reasons that really prompted me to want to do this today, because all of these conversations are trauma conversations, but we as a society don't want to have trauma conversations. We don't want to talk about that. And we don't look at animal behavior, symptoms, expressions from that lens. And until we as a society start voicing those kind of questions more frequently and louder, that then maybe a shift will start to occur. But we have to stop, allowing zoos to say, oh, well, that's just this behavior. No, it's because she's abused. It's because she's been beaten. It's because we need to start calling it what it is. And so I think that, you know, that's part of the gap, if you will. And again, for me, that's why I'm so invested in, we have to change our culture. We have to change how we have to change this conversation. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. We have to change the conversation we have around animals and trauma.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think it's very poignant right now too, because we are all as humans collectively going through an enormous trauma with the pandemic and being isolated. Can you speak to any luck that you've had, or maybe any tactics or ways of explaining and helping people connect what they're feeling as a human, and how we can get them to you know, understand the feelings that animals are having and that they are the same?
I think for myself, it's even just in having those conversations, right? Because we never talk about those in the same lens, you know, and transspecies psychology gives us that lens. And yet Gay and I talk all the time about the resistance in understanding that and seeing that. But I think it's the ability to, let's just sit down and let's talk about how this is same. And again, more people that are willing to do that, to recognize it, to even just open the door just ajar, you know, we'll have more and more of those conversations. But I find most people don't even want to open the door. Mm-hmm. And that's the hard part. But I think when we see it as, I guess, when I look at it as, when you approach it from what's happened, right? Something has happened that's caused them not to want to open the door. And so we need to even start at that point, and we have to find our commonality in it. To me, it is the humanness, it is the humanity in this endeavor, but it also goes back to, we're all one in this. And for me, it's that thing, I'm not well until we're all well, right? And so we really all need to grapple and really gain a larger understanding of what does that mean? And then work towards the same thing. We're all working towards the same goal, just doing it differently.
I think the really important thing that Jenny was so eloquent in saying that is that it's sort of, we want a lot of us, not everyone's the same. There's many different portals. You know, for example, for me, for many years, I used science, neuroscience and psychology, right? Because that's our epistemic authority. And I think that is still powerful. I don't think it's necessary, but it is for people, for example, who look to academia, who look to science as an authority and as something that would guide them. So that's a kind of an intellectual thing which can open the key to the door. I'll tell you one kind of experience. I led a master's class at a veterinary conference, and it was about birds, trauma in parrots. And so the audience was all specialists in birds and parrots. And I began with the brain and talking about, you know, some of the things that you've heard here, you know, in more formal things with PowerPoint. And then I started talking about, you know, trauma healing and love. And so what I did is I kind of did a left hemisphere thing, you know, the sort of, and everyone who didn't necessarily know neuroscience, but they kind of went, okay, great, that's okay, that's safe. And then that opened the door and to being able to really share their feelings. And there were people who were crying, you know, and that's really changing our culture. And so I think we have such an opportunity right now, despite the terrible suffering that's going on, we really have an opportunity to make this transformation. And it means we can't have our cake and eat it. For those of us, for those individuals who live a good life, you know, who have the funds, who have the security, you know, it depends on who you are. You know, there's a lot more to give, just so someone else can have some freedom. Mm-hmm. And so someone does not have to, the pain and the exploitation, people in prison, they don't have to be in prison to make us happy. You know, our happiness and our sense of security should not depend on the suffering of others. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly the case of elephants in zoos and animals in zoos and in the pet industry. That our happiness, we look at our happiness and our sense of comfort, it depends on the suffering of others. And that's a fundamental thing I think needs changing.
Thank you. While I'm finding the next question, Danny, I would love to hear from you because I know this is a passion of yours. And, you know, as an entrepreneur, it's one of your businesses, helping people move through their trauma so they can expand their circle of compassion.
Well, yeah, I've worked on my own trauma for most of my adult life so that I can be happier and be healthier. And I think through my own trauma work, it is really, really easy for me to connect with these animals and to, I'm going to try not to cry, and to see, you know, what they have gone through isn't really much different than what some of us have gone through. Mm-hmm. And, you know, never mind the illnesses and the injuries that you see on the papers that you know, if you think, well, the zoo is treating them, never mind it. They're sad. Doesn't that matter to you? Mm-hmm. They're sad. They're broken. Rose 2, I swear to Goddess, I have never seen her eyes. She's constantly looking down. That elephant is gone. She's gone. She won't connect with me. Chandra, she knows that I'm there. Chandra will help me to help her when I'm there. And people say, well, you only post these videos that you get. No. I don't spend that much time at the zoo. I can't. Okay, when I go, I spend maybe 30, 40 minutes there. I let them know that I'm there, I'm bearing witness. And they show us, like Gay was saying, they speak to us. They are letting us know that they are not well. It's up to us. All we have to do is listen. And by listening, all that really means is opening up your eyes and looking at them. You will hear loudly how they are. And it's not just the elephants, it's every animal, but these elephants in particular, are extremely sentient. They're extremely intelligent, more so than us, right? They really are. Mm-hmm. They are the epitome of Earth. They are nature. They are God. Mm-hmm. And this is how we are treating them. And it's unacceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, so the next question, has the PTSD in non-human animals ever been presented in a court of law as evidence? Have any of you worked with Non-Human Rights Project to explore this in their lawsuits?
I'll answer from my point of view. I have written copious letters and affidavits in, you know, the details, you know, of the science for elephants as well as other animals in court cases internationally. I don't know whether that's really being used. The psychological, it's not being used. In my understanding, it's been underutilized. And again, I'm not quite sure why, because I've always felt it's so powerful. You know, it's a reflexive thing. You know, it's like, you know, we see an elephant who's suffering and things like that, and immediately, because of the trauma, right? It's like, what's causing it? How's causing it? You know what I mean? So it's a very powerful tool. Where I did use it, that was used for some policy change, it was chimpanzees, and it was having to do with this concept of duty of care. And duty of care is, you know, these are kind of legal things that are kind of complex, but basically I got the idea from, there were two cases, and I spoke with a legal scholar in Australia, basically to vet it with her, since she's a legal scholar. And there were two cases. I think one was in England and one was in Australia. These were humans. They were police and firemen. And they won this case that the organizations, that their agencies had failed in carrying out the duty of care because they did not prepare them for the trauma that they were going to experience. They didn't do any debriefing or anything like that. And I used that argument about chimpanzees and monkeys, primates, who are used in experiments. And in the AWA, it specifies that they those in charge, psychologists, researchers, are responsible for the well-being, psychological well-being of their charges. Well, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, because putting them in a cage, right, alone, all that stuff, let alone the kinds of experiments that they impose upon them. So it's there, it just has not been taken up. And that is the critical thing, is that the conversation, the image, and I would also argue the experts that are called in legal situations should be neuroscientists and neuropsychologists. It doesn't take an elephant expert to talk about, I'm not an elephant expert compared to someone like Daphne or Carol, but I wrote very convincingly based on the science, and of course I vetted everything with them to make sure that the inference was correct. You know, you don't even have to know much. I mean, that's the power of, you know, of post-traumatic stress disorder. If you know that a person has experienced XYZ, that in itself, not even looking at the symptoms, you're more than halfway there in terms of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it really needs, you know, which I recommend, when expert witnesses are called on animal cases to court, that they call on a neuropsychologist. Alan Shore is one, for example, because these individuals, you know, and myself, we can speak with authority that the foundation for making those inferences is rock solid in science. So it's a glaring gap, as Jenny talked about, and hopefully it will start to find some engagement in the future very soon.
Yeah, and if I can just say, for me, that's something I struggle with greatly, because, you know, anytime a human being is diagnosed with PTSD, there are a plethora of therapies and supports and all kinds of things jump into action. And I don't care if that's a 5-year-old child or a 70, 80-year-old person. It's immediately there it is, and it's offered. And, you know, when you look at animals, sure, there's and don't get me wrong, these are great. There's all of the humanitarian conversations that take place. There's the scientific conversations that take place. There's the legal, you know, pieces that, thank goodness for Non-Human Rights Project, you know, and the case with Happy in front of the court and so forth. Like, thank goodness that those things are not happening. And yet it is not ever talked about. It is never offered. When are we going to say, wow, Chandra, you are suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Here are your therapies. Here are your supports. We're moving you to sanctuary because this is how you're going to heal. And I pray that I see the day that that's the conversation we're having, that that's the action that we see happening, because it is the same. And it is time that we start leveling the playing field of what we're doing for humans and what we're not doing for animals.
I have a chapter in my Elephants on the Edge where I took the medical records, Courtney, the medical records of an elephant. Her name was Jenny, and it was in Dallas. And I obtained those, and I basically just took out things, changed them so it was not species specific. So you couldn't identify what species the individual was, but essentially they were intact. And I shared them with about 7 or 8 colleagues who are psychoanalysts, they're psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, therapists, etc. And I said, would you please look at the case file of this individual? And if you can, come up with a diagnosis and a treatment plan. 201, they had no idea, they just did it. 201, they diagnosed her with complex PTSD. Each had a little bit of a slant because of the schools they go to. But essentially, that was all agreed. And the therapies varied a little bit, but essentially it was intensive trauma recovery therapy.
Yeah, and I will share as well, I'm diagnosed with complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you, the vast array of therapies that I have done and do to heal, I mean, it's insane. But for an animal, for someone like an elephant, the only therapy that they need is simply space, choice, like just allow them to connect with that elephant, that real elephant that's inside, and they will heal. Nature will heal herself if we just leave her be, right? So exactly. It's the same with elephants. If we just leave them be, yes, they can never go into the wild again. They can't. They won't survive. They don't know how. But we can give them what they deserve, which is space, which is autonomy, which is, choice. Like Gay said, may we soak your foot? And guess what? 9 times out of 10, the elephant's like, yeah, you can, because you're giving me bananas and love, and it feels good. Right. And like Lex says from Elephant Nature Park in Thailand, any elephant can be cured with bananas and love and bananas, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a great spot to wrap it up. I want to thank all of our speakers. Gay, thank you so much. And Jenny, Danny, Courtney, for all that you guys do at FOES. Again, my name is Chelsea Davis with Veggies Do It Better. We want to thank all of you for watching, everybody who shared this video, and will continue to share it, all of our amazing co-hosts. Today has been amazing. I personally have learned so much. It's really opened my eyes and given me so many more tools. Like, I didn't know about elephant restraints and rape racks and, the trauma that intergenerational trauma that animals face just as humans. And so I'm very excited. I don't know if excited is the right word, but I'm looking forward to using all of that in my advocacy moving forward. So in saying that, we want to invite all of you, regardless of if you live in Oregon or not, to please do your part. Give Metro, which is located here in Portland, a call and an email, and urge them to retire Chandra to sanctuary. You can find scripts in the description part of this event and reach out to FOES with any questions. And if you are looking to get more active, again, regardless if you are in Portland or not, because the positive of going through the pandemic right now is everything is virtual. So we definitely invite you to join us at the next Animal Rights Collective Portland community meeting, which will be on Wednesday, January 6th. This is an open meeting to anyone who wants to come and learn. Oftentimes we are talking about things that are applicable to people and their advocacy work all over the country and the world. So definitely tune in for that. And also keep an eye out. We are going to be doing a virtual action hour with ARC PDX, fully dedicated to FOES and releasing Chandra to sanctuary. It's just an hour of time and it makes a huge impact. We'll probably be doing that near the end of January once a new director for the zoo is announced, and then we can give them a very warm welcome. So again, want to thank everybody today for attending today's presentation. If you joined late, don't worry, you can watch the replay on the event page momentarily, and then also we will be uploading this to our YouTube channel. We look forward to continuing this fight together, and happy holidays, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Chelsea, for all that you've done.
Thank you, Chelsea and Danny, both. You did a great job. Excellent. Fantastic. And Jenny and Gay, you're marvelous. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please, everyone, check out Gay's book, Elephants on the Edge. It's a really, really good book. So I recommend it highly.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so I just stopped the stream.
Cool. How did it go?
Huh?
How did it go? Did a lot of people?
There were consistently around 50 people watching. Awesome. And there was a lot of turnover. I think we've got, like, the last I checked, it was like 150 comments.
Nice.
Wow. Nice.
So I'll look real quick.
Courtney, I think you made a question that I saw about elephants in zoos don't seem to vocalize as much.
Yeah.
We did.
You know, I'll give you my opinion why that is. What's there? I mean, I think it's a fear thing, you know. In other words, in general, when you make sounds, it's you expose yourself, right? You know, this is just sort of me extrapolating in nature. And actually, it's in my Talking with Bears book with Charlie Russell. You know, he says, we're the only species that makes a lot of noise, you know, like with bears. You're supposed to make a lot of noise to get the bear away. And the bear's like, what? I mean, typically animals will be quiet, right?
That actually makes sense because in one of my programs, that I'm working through some trauma, some childhood trauma, it's come to my attention, my awareness, that I am very quiet. I step very quietly. I close things very quietly. And that's because as a kid, I wanted to avoid the abuse, and I wanted to be invisible.
Yeah.
It really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, that's my first, response. The other is what is there to trumpet about? I mean,
that's a good question. Actually, the only time I ever heard them trumpet in all the years I've been going there is they were building the construction of elephant lands, and they all kind of ran together. Like, I've never seen them do that and trumpeted. It looked like they were frightened.
Yeah.
Maybe it was the noise. I'm not really sure, but that was the only time. And then when I went to pause, I actually heard elephants trumpet. I was like, oh my God, this is what they do.
Well,
so anyway, the contrast was stark.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of different elephant, if you go to Elephant Voices, Joyce Poole and her husband's website, they have the whole library of different sounds, but in general, Danny, that's the kind of the comment that I would make it, those two things, and they're probably communicating in other ways through their feet if they can hear each other through the din.
Well, and I also think that when all you're trying to do is literally make it to the next moment, and you are on hyper alert, hyper sensitivity 24 hours a day, you're never getting complete rest. You don't have time to trumpet. You don't have time to talk. Because you're just so focused on what's my next moment that to me, it's impossible from a trauma perspective.
So thank you so much, everyone. It was wonderful.
Yeah, you guys are awesome.
Just made a beautiful, you're really a model to follow in terms of the way you run this operation. So, and your individual and insights and professionalism is fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Keep us posted, whatever we can do in terms of to support, further.
It's so cool. I'm a little starstruck that Dame, or that you did know Dame Daphne. I was like, oh, what?
Yeah.
Me too. I'm starstruck.
I already told Carol, I said, if Chandra, or really if any elephant gets there, when they do, I'm on my way. I was like, you don't have to pay me, but I'm your staff. So
yeah. Well, she's, I have to say about Daphne is, Daphne had no formal training, right? And I think that's, that's just testimony. She was a beautiful, beautiful person, and she loved. Mm-hmm. I mean, that to me was just, she was a tough cookie. She was a non-BS-y kind of person, but she was extremely loved and just, and trauma informed. There's this one story, I'll let you go, but I remember talking to her and she's saying, well, they're not, some of the babies were not eating their bottle. And so this is the incredible naturalists like Charlie Russell, like George Adamson. They don't need science. You just need to listen and pay attention and care. And she noticed, well, for some, so she put this old army blanket, this gray, hairy army blanket up, and had the nursing bottle pushed underneath, because the babies, what they do normally is they push against their mother and then they nurse. And so for some babies, that was really necessary for them to have that full body kind of engagement in that way.
Yeah, it's really just about connect. Like, she just connected. All you have to do is connect. They'll tell you what they need.
Love and really, really, and honesty, honest love and eyes on the prize. She wasn't doing it for any other reason than to help the elephants. That was it.
Well, and I like the story of the gentleman that is being hired, or going to be hired, to be a orphan caretaker, and he's in a room with like 10 other people that are all there for that job, and he's all nervous, and they walk in and they hand him each one their green coat and say, okay, go out there with the elephants and they'll teach you how to feed and they'll teach you the routine. But it's the elephants who will hire you. because the elephants will know you're there because you care and because you love them. And 30 days from now, we will know by them who that is. There's no interview. The elephants will tell us.
Yeah.
You still do that.
They still do that?
Well, they won't hire you or I already checked into it.
Yeah. I'm supposed to go to Kenya. I'm supposed to visit DSWT. I got pushed from COVID, and then I was supposed to go this month, but I pushed it back until next year. I'm
going sometime, but they will only hire locals, which is the right thing to do.
That's good. They say the same thing at Elephant Nature Park, but I still might move to either Thailand or somewhere. I don't know. I might, just to be closer, to be of hand. I don't need to be paid. I don't know how I'll live, but hopefully I can do my readings virtually and I get enough that I can. But you know, I don't, it's like
I'm right there with you, sister.
You know, I don't care. If you just give me a few meals, fine, I'll sleep with the elephants, no problem.
Very fun.
All right, let's take a quick picture with everybody and then we'll say goodbye. Okay, everybody smile. Cute.
Courtney.
I hate pictures. Even though I'm a photographer, I really hate having my picture taken. Is it over?
I hate painting, even though that's what I do. I'm sorry I was screwing up my words so much. Sometimes.
Oh, Chelsea, you did beautifully.
You did great, yeah.
It was absolutely unnoticeable. Don't worry about it.
Oh, Chelsea, come on, you were perfect. Hey, listen, one more thing. January 9th, we're doing an international candlelight vigil for elephants that died in captivity over 2020. So everybody check that out. We're going to be posting about that. Danny, I can start taking over for Facebook and start posting about that because that's our next big thing is January 9th. So everyone, just check in on that and we'll give you updates as they come in. And
great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. This has been a pleasure.